Have you seen the movie Jennifer's Body? Released in 2009, this horror film starring Megan Fox has almost achieved cult status. Although it is clearly aimed at a teenage audience, with much of the action taking place in a high school and plenty of humor, it is still quite brutal. Without giving too much away, it's about an innocent schoolgirl who suddenly develops demonic powers after a fateful evening. Why am I telling you this? Because the story we're talking about today is said to have inspired this modern horror classic. Today we're talking about the story of Elyse Pahler. It's 1995, and there's absolutely nothing going on in the small town of Arroyo Grande, California. The nearest large city, San Luis Obispo, isn't far away, but even there are only just over 40,000 people. For teenagers who naturally have an urge to discover the world and perhaps be a little more independent, life in Arroyo Grande must be pretty boring. But not for three friends: Royce Casey, Joseph Joe Fiorella, and Jacob DeLashmutt. The boys are between 14 and 16 years old and are known for their rebellious behavior. All three have been expelled from school. Royce now attends a special school, Joe is homeschooled, and Joseph goes to a different school. In short, things are going relatively badly for the three friends. Unfortunately, we don't know the reasons behind this, such as what goes on at home for the boys. But we do know how the boys spend their time and take their minds off things. Because what binds Royce, Joe, and Jacob together more than anything else is their fascination with the metal genre. The boys also play instruments themselves and, of course, want to play at least as well as their idols. They form their own band and call themselves Hatred. The three friends hang out in their rehearsal room all the time. However, practicing their instruments gradually takes a back seat. Instead, the boys smoke marijuana together and allegedly take other substances such as mushrooms. And of course, they talk about their current favorite bands and albums. Royce, Joe, and Jacob develop a real fascination for the lyrics of some metal songs in particular. Joe takes the music very literally. And one day he asks his buddy DeLashmutt what it would be like to sacrifice a virgin, and whether Jacob would be up for it. According to his own account, Jacob doesn't think much of it and agrees, not entirely seriously. But Joe is actually serious. The song that Joe likes the most is by the band Slayer and is called Dead Skin Mask. The lyrics are based on the story of the serial killer Ed Gein. They say, "Dance with the dead in my dreams. Listen to their hollowed screams. The dead have taken my soul. Temptations lost all control." On July 22, 1995, the six-member Pahler family from Arroyo Grande is sitting comfortably together. The Pahlers do this regularly. Although the children are already teenagers, the family is very close. Above all, their shared faith binds the Pahlers together. And spending the evening together is part of that. 15-year-old Elyse is lying on the couch with her parents, her two sisters, and her brother. The Pahlers are enjoying a cozy evening in front of the TV, watching an old Western movie starring Clint Eastwood. Shortly after 9 p.m., the family's phone rings. Elyse answers and has a brief conversation. Shortly after hanging up at around 9:15 p.m., she announces that she's tired and is going to bed. Neither her parents nor her siblings think anything of it. Only Elyse's father has a strange feeling in his gut. It's as if his daughter is up to something. But he pushes the thought aside. They wish Elyse good night, and little by little the Pahlers' house falls silent. But as you can imagine, Elyse doesn't go to sleep. Instead, she does what so many teenagers do sooner or later. she sneaks out of the house in the evening. Because the call she received during the TV night was from Joe, Jacob, and Royce. Elyse knows them from school, from before the three of them were expelled. The boys have invited her to smoke weed with them. She is described as curious and eager to experiment. And a secret joint late at night probably sounds like an enticing option to a teenager. In her free time, Elyse designs her own clothes. Fashion is her big hobby, and she can well imagine doing something in that field later on. But she also likes to sing and dance. As a creative girl, she is interested in everything to do with art. This allows her to express herself, and she always encourages her friends to stick with their hobbies and passions and pursue their dreams and goals. Elyse is 15 years old, has blonde hair and blue eyes. And that's exactly why the three boys invited her. And because they suspect that Elyse is still a virgin. Joe, in particular, is said to have watched Elyse very closely in the weeks leading up to the date, even following her at times. The four meet near Elyse's parents' house in an area called Nipomo Mesa, on the edge of a quiet forest. At first, everything goes as smoothly as Elyse had imagined. The boys have something to smoke, and for about 15 to 20 minutes, the teenagers just sit together. But at some point, Jacob steps behind Elyse and suddenly wraps his belt around her neck. He squeezes. Although Elyse is probably a little intoxicated, she fights back immediately. But Elyse is alone, and the boys are three. While Jacob holds her in a headlock with his belt, Joe pulls out a knife and stabs Elyse directly in the throat. He then passes the knife to his two friends. The boys take turns stabbing Elyse. Elyse's legs give way and she falls to the ground. The boys later recount how Elyse cried out for her mother and then for God. The boys kick Elyse in the throat to keep her quiet. Then they drag her body to a small patch of grass where Elyse Pahler bleeds to death. Royce, Joe, and Jacob then dig a shallow grave and bury Elyse. Her body will remain there for months. Joe, Royce, and Jacob get away with it for the time being. Of course, Elyse's parents notice that the 15-year-old is missing on the morning of July 23rd and immediately call the police. Although the police launch an investigation, they do not believe that Elyse has been the victim of a crime. For the police, Elyse Pahler is a classic runaway case. It is not until the spring of 1996 that Royce Casey, at least, begins to be plagued by a guilty conscience. He confesses to a priest and tells him about Elyse's murder. Apparently, he has turned to Christianity in the meantime. The priest persuades him to turn himself in to the police. And that is exactly what Royce does on March 14th, 1996. He also tells them about the other two boys, Joe and Jacob, who are then questioned by the police. It doesn't take long before all three confess to the murder of Elyse Pahler. Soon after, the police find her body. The decomposition is so advanced that she can only be identified by her teeth and a plastic bracelet with red hearts that she always wore. Unfortunately, her body is already too decomposed for an informative autopsy. It is still visible that her pants have been removed. The boys have given conflicting statements about what they did with Elyse after her death. However, the police and the public prosecutor's office assume that they also desecrated the body. When asked about their motive, the boys give a shocking answer. Royce tells a police officer that Elyse was a victim of the devil. The three wanted to sacrifice Elyse so that the devil would help them and advance their music career. The boys use the lyrics of their musical idols as a direct reference, and indirectly as inspiration for the murder of Elyse. One can only guess how convinced the three were that Satan really exists and would accept a human sacrifice in some form. But they must have told this story convincingly enough during police interrogations, because to this day, it is considered the official motive for the murder. When Royce, Joe, and Jacob stand trial, they remain silent. They are therefore convicted on the basis of what they said during the interrogations. Although all three are still minors at the time of the trial, they are sentenced under adult criminal law. They receive life sentences and thus at least 25 years. If you've been doing the math in your head, you've already figured out that this time is already up. But Royce, Jacob, and Joe, who are now all in their 40s, are still not free. They are still in different prisons to this day. So far, no parole request has been approved. Royce, in particular, is still trying to get out on parole. However, every application he has made so far has been rejected. Five years after the murder of the schoolgirl, something else happens in 2000. Elyse Pahler's family tries to sue the metal band Slayer. If you don't know Slayer, I mentioned them briefly at the beginning. Slayer is, or was, a pretty big metal band. The band that inspired Joe, Jacob, and Royce to form their own metal band, Hatred. And if the Pahlers have their way, it also inspired the murder of Elyse. But it's not just Slayer who is being held accountable, but also music distributors who worked with the band and released Slayer's albums. Elyse's family believes that Slayer's often very graphic and controversial lyrics served as inspiration for Elyse's murder. In the mid-90s, Slayer's target audience was no longer just the usual circle of metal fans. The band was also trying to reach younger fans. Music channels such as MTV, which were booming at the time, naturally helped in this regard. The Pahler family sees this marketing strategy as gross negligence. In their opinion, Slayer's lyrics, which deal with violence and extreme practices, should never have been deliberately targeted at teenagers. The statement of claim submitted reads as follows. The distribution and marketing of this obscene and harmful material to male adolescents constitutes aiding and abetting the criminal acts described in this complaint. The material in question is Slayer's music. But the family goes even further. The document also states that none of the heinous crimes committed against Elyse Marie Pahler would have been committed without the deliberate marketing strategy of the band Slayer. So, is the metal band Slayer partly to blame for Elyse's murder? No. That's the independent ruling of two judges, who have each dismissed a lawsuit brought by the Pahlers against the band Slayer and the respective music distributors. There is no legal way to hold the band Slayer responsible in any way for Elyse's death, because violence, Satanism, and other controversial topics are omnipresent, not only in Slayer's music, but also in books, films, series, newspaper articles, and so on. And in a country where there is a right to free creative expression, such topics cannot be banned from art. One of Elyse's three murderers, Jacob, said himself in an interview from prison that the music didn't really have anything to do with Elyse's murder. The music may be destructive, but ultimately Elyse died because Joe was so crazy about her. Well, and because his friends Royce and Jacob helped him commit the crime. I know many of you are probably wondering about Elyse's parents' lawsuit and think it's exaggerated and overly sensitive. And yes, perhaps it is when viewed objectively. But you also have to consider who is suing. Namely, a mother and father whose daughter was killed with unimaginable violence. Parents who, even after Elyse's murder, still have to be there for their three other children, raise them, and somehow put food on the table. Elyse's father had to give up his job for several years after his daughter's murder and go into treatment. The family lost their home and had to live on welfare for a time. And all this while they were still trying to come to terms with Elyse's brutal murder. The Pahlers have always emphasized that they are not interested in censoring or even banning Slayer. If it were up to them, the band could continue to write and play their music. But without targeting children, a lawsuit based on this premise was already doomed to failure in 2000. And today, in the age of digitalization and streaming services, something like that is of course no longer conceivable. Basically, however, this topic touches on another issue that is perhaps more relevant here. Media literacy, that children need to be taught how to deal with fiction in a conscious and sensitive way. With books, films, and also with song lyrics, especially when these children are in emotional crisis. That brings us to the end of today's video. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I think we largely agree on the topic of music and song lyrics. Basically, it's nothing more than the eternal debate about first-person shooters. But if you have other thoughts on the matter or consider such content to be critical, feel free to write them in the comments. This kind of objective exchange is always interesting and one of the coolest things about this community. At this point, I'd like to thank you again for all your comments and likes. You know that it helps the channel enormously, so thank you for your support. If you like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any new videos. Other than that, there's not much more to say. I wish you a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching the video, and hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, bye everyone.